How's everybody doing? Good to see you all. Thanks for coming out. Who has been to one of these speaker series events? Show of hands. Okay, we've got some first timers here. Welcome. Thanks for coming out. So what is the Center for Story? I'm Sean Murphy, and I direct the Center for Story right now, and for the foreseeable future. It's a mostly virtual space, and the whole goal is to celebrate story and interrogate narrative and go deeper, because when I talk about story, people think and say, you're talking about fairy tales, right? And I'm like, nope. And they're like, oh, you're talking about books. No, everything is story. And at a college especially, it does us all a lot of good to think about how is what everything that you're all studying, that what happens in the world of business and entertainment is all story and narrative. So advertisements on TV, that's story. A political campaign, which we're all still fresh from, that's story and narrative. So this series is an attempt for me to speak with experts in their fields and have them talk about what they do and how they've attained mastery and what we all can learn, but also to think about how narrative and story drive these things and hopefully awaken some sensibilities about we all have stories, we all can tell stories, we all can share stories. It's empowering, it's a way to connect. So I look forward to doing a lot more events like this in the months and years ahead. But for tonight, I'm really happy that you're here. Make sure you get your Beyond the Classroom credits. There's things to scan. I make it a point to say I want to talk to really cool experts in their field, and all of them are, but sometimes it's really special. So tonight, we have a real expert who has traveled to be here. Please give a round of applause for our special presenter tonight, Lora Kelley. And I will introduce her briefly, and I'll let her introduce. You'll do a better job, but I think all of us like it when someone else gets to brag a little bit. So I'm gonna read the brief bio so that we know what we're dealing with here, because it's very impressive. Lora Kelley is a trauma-informed story work and life coach who specializes in guiding individuals and groups on their journey to healing. As the host of the Storied Living podcast, she explores the arc of healing through story and the reconnection of mind and body. Lora is a core facilitator with the Allender Center, where she facilitates NFTC2, Narrative-Focused Trauma Care Level 2, and teaches in Level 3 on holistic business practices and thriving as a trauma survivor. An artist as well, Lora writes songs and poetry, I'm looking forward to talking to her a little bit about that reflect her passion for personal growth. She lives on a conserved farm in North Garden, Virginia with her partner and 3 children ages 4, 11, and 14. Lora, thank you so much for being here. It's a true honor and pleasure. I am going to help facilitate, but I'm mostly going to get out of the way because I know you've got a lot to talk about.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's really a privilege to be here. I don't have a lot of opportunities to speak to y'all's age group. I have not been in college since 2003. And so when I started actually thinking about coming here, I began to sort of imagine myself back as an 18-year-old in the story that I was living in 2003. And I thought to myself, man, what would have helped me? What would have been important for me to know? What do I wish someone had looked at me and said that would have changed the trajectory of the next decade of my life and put me on a course towards healing much sooner? And so part of what I have prepared for you is a little bit about what I do, but also just an invitation to consider your own story and how your life has been impacted and how you impact others and how we can be more present with each other in our own work. So I hope that captivates you for your extra credit hour that you're here. So nice, thank you. All right, so the title of this is Storytelling Between the Lines, Listening for the Stories We Don't Know We're Telling. So we're gonna kind of move through this time in 4 movements, and I'm open to questions. I think that when we come to story and engaging our story, it's really important to have our bodies and our minds online and to feel like we have the opportunity to engage. And so it's important for me that I'm not just talking at you. So we're gonna talk about listening, which will be the first movement, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about story, which is why we're here. And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about how story intersects with trauma and give you some perspectives. It'll be short on that. And then we'll step into a Q&A time. All right. So as I was coming to this particular time to be with each of you, and I was thinking about the title, what does it mean to listen between the lines? In the work that I do, it's typically written narratives. So when I sit across from someone or I sit across from a group, people are writing their story. They're picking a story out of a certain time frame of their life. So let's say from the ages of 3, when you might have your first memory, all the way up to the ages of 18. And you write a catalog of those stories. You sort of think of it as if you go back over the history of your life and you run your hand over the history of your life and you look for bumps, places where there are moments where you've had the sense of like, ouch, didn't really like that. Wasn't my favorite experience. Felt like something shifted for me, perspective in my life. And so when I work with people, they write a catalog of those stories, and there we go. And then they pick one and they write it, and they actually bring it in and we engage it. And when I do work for the Allender Center, that's primarily in group work. So we actually get to engage those stories in a group setting. You would bring it in and talk with people. And when you're listening for someone's story, when you're sitting with someone and you're listening to their story, you're listening not just with your ears, but you're also listening with your body. You're listening with your eyes. You're listening with your context, and you're listening with yourself, with your own story. Oh, I'm gonna get this. It's gonna be great. Most of the time, when we sit with people and we're sitting across from them at coffee, or we bump into them on a train, or we're in a subway, or we're having polite conversation, at a cocktail party or whatever, typically the stories that we tell are at 10,000 feet or 100,000 feet. So when you come to a story, you always want to be asking yourself, how is this story being told? Am I above the story, or am I getting a ground view? Am I on the ground in the story? Really good narratives, really good stories that we love, world-building stories, are always telling the story from the ground. And you can feel that because your body feels like it's moving through the story. It feels like you have a sense of the space, you have a sense of the time. So can you notice when you're with someone and you're in their presence and they're sharing something with you, what you're hearing? Or do you notice what you're telling? How do you talk about your story to other people? I love this. Listening is a dyad. So when we're listening, we're assuming there's somebody on the other end. There's somebody on the other end, and that their ears are available to hear us. Both people moving through layers of self and building trust together as we engage with one another's story. I loved this quote by David Augsburger. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. Can you remember a time when someone sat with you and you shared something with them and they heard you? They saw your face. They saw something that flashed across your face, something you didn't even know you were telling them. And they looked at you and they heard you. It's a powerful experience. It's being attuned to intentionally. I created this on Canva. Anybody else use Canva? Yeah, okay, I just love Canva. I just thought this picture was so cute. I don't know, the unicorns and stuff. So what is listening, right? What is listening when we come to a story and we are holding space for ourselves and we're sitting across from someone else and we're sitting down with coffee and someone's walked in and they bring their body and they sigh heavily and they say something to you? Stories usually begin something like this when I sit with people. I was a really difficult kid. My mom yelled at me all the time. Or, we moved here when I was 3. When you think about those sentences, do you notice that they're a story? They're a story. What does it mean to sit with 3 sentences? 3 sentences that someone hands you, and to begin to open yourself up to the fact that there is an entire microcosm of a life in those sentences. To be able to sit with 3 sentences and say, I'm beholding something of the significance of this person's story. What does it mean? So I put storytelling, listening, because when we're sitting with storytelling and we're sitting with listening, again, it's always both people. How checked in are you? There's this woman I follow on Instagram, and she talks about spicy children. She's like trying to help parents figure out how to parent their spicy kids. And I appreciate it because I was a spicy kid. And she talks about phubbing. Is this a word you guys are familiar with? Phubbing? Phubbing? Phubbing. All right, well, now you'll know. You're going to feel really relevant when you go home and talk to your parents. You're going to be like, listen, phubbing. They probably won't know either unless they follow her. Phubbing is being in the presence of another person and looking at your phone instead of looking at their face. Whoa. Okay, did I get some credit? That was good. Right, phubbing. Right, it's a moment where we, oh no, did someone get called out? Is a moment where we're looking at each other and we check out. We step out of the connective space. We miss opportunities to be with the 3 sentences that matter in our lives with each other. What would you have to ask to get to the story? My mom, I was just a difficult kid. My mom yelled at me all the time. What would you have to ask to get to the story? What do you mean by difficult? What does that even mean? How did you know you were difficult? Who told you? What do you mean yelled at all the time? It takes a capacity to hear what's not being said. It takes capacity to hear what's not being said when you're in the presence of somebody else. How slow and how present are you willing to be with the body that's sitting across from you and the sentences, the small fragments, right, of story that each person in this world is offering you as they sit with you? Is all the time once a week? Were you yelled at once a week? So if you're 22 and you were yelled at once a week, that's 1,144 times. Wow. You feel how that's a different story? Right? When someone hands you a sentence like, I was a difficult kid, I was yelled at all the time. 1,144 times. And that's the body that you're sitting across from, right? What's the impact of that? Can you notice? Can you feel how the story changes when you begin to lean in and invite curiosity? What would you need to know to be fascinated? When I sit across from people and they give me 3 sentences, I am like, what's the whole thing? I want to know. How did that impact you? What's the experience been like? What's the bridge we're going to need to build to move from yelled at all the time, which is going to create a shock response in the body, messes with your proprioception, your ability to hear, being able to decide, like, can I hear things around me? What's the impact, right? What's the bridge we're going to need to build from that place to a place where you don't jolt to be with your body? I moved when I was 3. What would you need to know to be fascinated? Why did you move? Well, there was a war. My mom's a really good friend, actually pretty much all of her friends, she worked in the oil and gas industry in Houston. So she had a lot of friends from different countries, and it was really an incredible experience to grow up in that kind of diversity. But several of her friends came over as refugees. And one of them, it happened during the Vietnam War, and she was on a boat. She was on a boat for months, right, when she was a child. Why did you move? One sentence, I moved here when I was 3. All you have to do is ask, why? What caused you to move? And you're in the story. You know something more of the person. What was it like after you moved? Can you still feel that in your body? The movement of the water? What does it feel like to drink salt water? Can you be close to water after having been on water for that long? What's the impact? What would you need to know to be fascinated? Are you bold? Can you be bold enough to notice the meaning? It was during the Vietnam War. How did you get here? What can you open yourself up to imagine for a boat ride from Vietnam to the United States as a refugee? It's profound. When we fub, right? We miss the sentence. That's the key to the life of the person in front of us. We miss being fascinated by each other, the stories that each of us hold that are sitting in this room right now, right? We miss the opportunity to be connected. We miss the opportunity to give the gift of hearing, which is to say the gift of love to one another. Can you feel how the story changes the sentence? When we come to stories with each other, we're looking at all the same things that you look at when you look at a regular story. I studied creative writing. I loved creative writing. That's how I learned how to write trauma narratives. I just took my trauma and put it in a creative fiction and passed it as fiction. It was great, right? I was like, I can process this out loud to a lot of people. Just pretend it wasn't my story. Oops. Theme. What's the theme, right? So if you imagine you're sitting across from someone and they have come here from Vietnam on a boat as a refugee because of the war, what's the theme, do you think, for a story like that? Suspense? Terror? Right? What's the setting? What's the setting of your life? Right now we're in Virginia. So we're in the setting of Virginia. We're at Shenandoah University. We're in this classroom. We're in this setting. We each have stories that are here in our bodies. What's the context? We're in 2024 post-election, right? It's a particular context. Who are the characters? Who are the characters in your story, right? Mom, dad, siblings, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers. Who's there? Who isn't there? Why? Genre, voice, POV. That's a real thing, right? What's the emotionality? The tone. As I started talking, and I was talking about the Vietnam refugee, as I started talking and we came in and we noticed to be yelled at weekly 1,144 times, did you feel more intrigued or afraid? What did you notice in your body as we get closer to the ground? Does it feel more interesting? Do you want to flee? To read or hear a story well requires us as people to notice and to be present for all of these categories, to know that we each come with categories, we each come with characters, we each come with particularity of how the world has shaped and formed us. We all come with impact. To read or hear a story well requires us as people to notice and be present with each other. Listening also requires humility and a risk to know you may not know all that's required to read the story well. You may not know all that's required to read the story well. What does that mean? It means that I am not always the best person to understand someone else's story. I can be curious about what the experience was like for them, but my face might represent something to them that is actually risky. My body might actually be risky to them. Can I stay present enough with them to navigate the bind of what I might represent for them when I'm in the presence of their story? Am I willing to do that? Can I be humble enough to know I don't know? And that is actually really powerful. It's a powerful position. Is your curiosity and human connection leading you toward the other? Are you willing to let it lead you toward the other so that we can bear witness to one another's stories and one another's lives? I just loved this. Kids get it. Like, they are willing to get down on the ground and be like, I don't even know what's off there, but don't you kind of want to know? Like, what are they looking at that has got them so captivated that they're willing to get down on hands and knees, both of them? Right? That's the posture when we sit with each other. All right, let's take a beat and a pause. How about a breath? Just an inhale and an exhale. How about one more? So nice. Somatic, the body. What are you noticing? If you took just a second and you checked in with your body, what are you noticing in your body as we sit here with the word trauma? It's a little bit of a buzzword right now. Anybody feel like it's everywhere? Like trauma's everywhere? We talk about it a lot. I think anytime you have a word that gets captivated in that way, it can be really beautiful because it just makes us more aware of what's in the space, but also it can begin to lose meaning. So I want to take a minute and just offer some definitions that might help us be grounded. Yes. What are the stories in our space right now? So I said I work with trauma. So as I come here and I sit with you, I bring hundreds of trauma narratives with me, along with my own, right? Along with my own. So I sit here thinking about my 18-year-old self. She'd probably be down here. She got busted one time and sat in the back, and then my professor emailed me and was like, I know you didn't study when you sit in the back. It's kind of obvious. It's like called out. Right, but what stories are in the space? We all bring our bodies, and all of our bodies have stories, and they're all here. So this is a picture. About 4 years ago, I used to go to this church, and at the church, there was a deacon who was brought up on sexual assault charges of a child. And yeah, it was big. And as an advocate and as a person who works with sexual abuse, I felt very intent upon ensuring that the way that was handled correctly. But bumped up against all the things that you bump up against in institutional spaces, especially spaces where there's a lot of spiritual bypassing. And so I created this icon of the church to send to the pastor, trying to explain to him what's in the space. What's in the space? I said, this is what you see. This is what you see when you walk into church, but this is what's there. The blue dots are sexual abuse victims, men. The pink dots are sexual abuse victims, women. And I put Jesus. Because you don't hang up on a cross with clothes on. Your genitals are out there. So there's an experience of being humiliated. And I put the pastor, and he asked me how I knew, and I said, I had sat with you. I just knew, right? This is what's in the space. So forgive me, but I pulled up the demographics of where we are today. All of the red dots represent ACEs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with ACEs, but ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences, it was a term coined by Dr. Nadine Burke as she was studying cardiovascular failure and immune disease. And people were dying, and she was just so confused, and there was no causation. She could not figure out why was this happening? They were otherwise healthy. And as she began to study and interview people, she began to notice that one of the correlations was adverse childhood experiences, that the rate of heart failure and disease, immune issues showed up when you had particular adverse childhood experiences. So all of the green represents sexual abuse. This is all of the undergraduates here at Shenandoah University. Yellow represents people who have had 2 adverse childhood experiences or more. Orange is, the peachy color is 3, and orange is 4 or more. Black dots are people who have not experienced that. This is what's in the space. These are the stories in the bodies that we bump up against every single day. Oh, I might have to shush. Oh, there we go. Are you willing to notice? Are you willing to notice that people are here and they're impacted? And to be able to be with the impact in your own story, whatever that might be for you. And to notice when you're coming across someone else who also holds a story. This is the likelihood of this. It's pretty fascinating. So this is my definition. It's long, so forgive me, I'm gonna read it to you. Trauma is an in-storied experience where safety, delight, attunement, and support ought to be present, but are instead replaced with an event or layers of events, 1,144, that induce shock, disorientation, a sense of powerlessness and overwhelm. This comes at a too much, too fast, too soon pace, where the person is subsequently left in silence or without proper support and accurate narrative interpretation. Someone is not helping them read their story correctly. It's taken in. This is me. This is my fault. I did this. Something's wrong with me. I'm not worth it. I'm not enough. I can't get there. This will be too much. I won't be able to do it. Internalized. It's in-storied. Every single traumatic experience that any person has, whether it's a big T trauma, like war, or a little t trauma, which someone would say being yelled at would be considered a little t trauma till you walk it out and get on the ground floor. Every single one of those happens in a story. It happens in a context. It happens with characters. It follows the same cadence, right? You enter the story, there's a rising action, there's a conflict, there's a falling action, a denouement, and then a conclusion. Every trauma narrative follows the same story arc. I love this quote by Maya Angelou. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. Right? That's trauma. Trauma is not the story of something that happened back then, but the current imprint of the pain, horror, and fear living inside of you. So when we sit with ourselves and we notice, like, oh my gosh, why do I keep responding this way? What's a trigger, right? What you're looking at is a story from way back when showing up in the present and reenacting itself. In order to care for those places, it requires us to tell the story, to be present with the story, to engage the story. I like this one. Trauma is not a disorder. It's been called that. Not a disorder, but it's a wound. And we all bear the wounds of this life, don't we? We all have wounds. Trauma is what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. To be heard is as close to being loved, right? Changes everything to have someone bear witness. We are a story, each of you. And I would implore you to consider that, to consider what life you've lived, what it matters that you've lived the life that you've lived, all the experiences that you have that have formed you, that have shaped you, that impact you. Our lives are composed of millions of stories, but most have been forgotten or simply don't register as important. Is it important to notice? I was yelled at. Like, you sort of just blow that off. Should I even register that? Is that worth sharing? If we fail to know the themes of our unique story, we are less likely to live that story well. I just know this because I sit with people all the way up until their 70s who are literally sit across from me and say things like, I've never told someone this before. I've never told someone this before. And just to speak it and to have someone across from them say, it's a big story, changes everything. I saw this week. I don't know, maybe someone else saw this going around. I get the feeling my algorithm might be slightly different than yours. But I thought this was so beautiful. When I come to the stage to speak, to translate, I bring everyone who has ever been kind with me. We have the opportunity, if we are willing to be bold, to be the kind person that goes with us into these hard places, to bear witness to each other's suffering, to be curious, to be bold, to be humble. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I should have said, I usually say at the beginning of these, obviously these are informal, so we want to make sure if there's any questions or comments, please don't be shy.
Yes.
Taking these kind of ideals and such, what would your opinion be on taking these and incorporating for a younger generation to incorporating it into games, whether it be like tabletop, D&D, or video games? How would you see that helping the current generation?
Seymour, what do you see as the problem? What would we be helping?
To acknowledge and address. A lot of people, especially my age, mid-20s, either openly talk about it or push it down. So how would you see it being possible to incorporate into that kind of sphere to be able to touch into interests and such that they look to? Would you see it being helpful, or how would you incorporate that with your knowledge?
Yeah, so let me make sure I'm hearing you, and so I can make sure I'm answering you congruently. Are you saying, so for example, you would be at a party and you might be playing a game, and I'm hearing you say in your generation, people either share their stories pretty openly or people sort of shove it down.
Yes.
So I think, one, noticing, do I have the capacity in the moment to be with what's being shared with me? As I said, it's a dyad, so it's like two people inviting consent on both sides.
Right.
Does the person have consent to be shared with? Would you be open to me sharing some of my story with you, would be an example. Or if you're the person who's shoving it down and you're noticing I'm in the presence of somebody who's got a big story, and at this moment they're having a hard time being present with that story, are you willing to walk the pace necessary to allow them to unfold? It's a lot slower than we would like it to be, right? It can just start with noticing, like, I'm noticing this is a big story, and I'm also noticing you don't really want to be with it right now. Right? Even something like that allows them to be seen, but also allows them to be dignified in their choice to preserve whatever it is that's happening for them in that moment. Does that answer your question?
Mostly, yes.
Which part doesn't it answer?
Could you see it being beneficial to put it into that kind of a format?
Oh, to like talk about our narratives in like a social setting where there's games? Sure, absolutely. I think as long as there's consent, and people feel like they can be safe with themselves and safe with you, that might actually be a really lovely way to engage. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great question. Anybody else? Yes.
How would you go about, say you have a family member that you don't really talk to a ton anymore? Maybe you've gone no contact or low contact or whatever, the difference of views or whatever. What is a good way to go about reconnecting with those people and trying to facilitate a discussion about stories? Maybe it's a misunderstanding or some sort of disconnect. How can you facilitate discussions in sort of difficult, I guess, familial spheres, like reconnecting with family or family friends or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, first I just want to notice that's hard. Like it's hard. I mean, what you're describing is rupture, right? It's a relational rupture, and those kinds of experiences don't happen for no reason. So there's harm present and likely grief, sense of loss. So just being willing to be honest with yourself about what's present for you, I think is the first step. And if you're desiring to move towards someone and try to facilitate some kind of repair, is first to be with yourself and to really notice, like, what's here for me? What's happened? And also, to also notice your intention and your capacity. What do I notice in my own body? How much capacity do I have to facilitate this? And do I need support? I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say. And then, again, and I sort of said this, pacing, I think, is really important. Being able to allow yourself a slow pace to let those conversations unfold over time. Because if you're facilitating a repair, you're also going to want to be discerning, what's the capacity of the other person? Do they have the ability to repair? Do they have the ability to notice that they have the capacity to hurt someone? Is that even something that's within the realm of their ability to say, I can harm someone else, I can hurt somebody? If that's not even in their realm of capacity, repair is gonna be just you eating the rupture to stay peaceful. Does that make sense as I say that?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
What if the answer to that is no?
Yeah. So if you're engaging with somebody who has so much defensive structures that they can't even bear the thought that they have the ability to hurt somebody else, that relationship and the degree of intimacy you're going to be able to have in that relationship is going to be very shallow. Yeah. And so again, like I said, then you move into loss, then you move into grief. And it's a really important thing to be able to be present with for yourself, because if we're talking, I'm talking to you right now, but you deserve a lot of care for that. So,
Hey, thanks.
thanks.
All right, I'm going to ask a question, and maybe this will stimulate.
Yeah.
I would love you to talk a little bit about, you mentioned in your biography that you also are creative. And I'm curious that if you could talk a little bit about how you both separate and combine kind of the creative impulse and that curiosity. I think, in my experience, I've found that we can talk about the truth that we all are made of story. We all have stories to tell. We can and should be hearing other people's stories. But what are some ways, in your experience, in your expertise, that all of us can have tools through creativity to begin to heal or to use our own creativity where maybe we're not ready to discuss or talk, but just the act of exploring and creating can be a facilitator for all sorts of like personal discovery.
Absolutely. I write a lot of poetry. I write a lot of songs. I did, like I said, in college, I did a lot of short fiction, in quotes. And that was a really helpful way to process my experiences and also to create space between myself and the experiences that I had had. So I think poetry is a beautiful way, and I think metaphor, narrative, finding images that evoke something in you, just allowing yourself to get into your body. I think that's the biggest thing that people miss. A lot of times this is a cognitive exercise where we're kind of up in our head trying to get all the right information and make all the right decisions. And at the same time, we have this body that holds all of these stories, and it's a physiology, an internal physiology. So being able to settle down into your body and kind of noticing like what's the story my body is holding, and how would I describe that, I think can be really powerful. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
It totally does. Yeah. It totally does, and I'll follow up, and I'd love to see if this has any reactions. So I feel like when I was your all's age, social media didn't exist. So when we talked about stories, it was a more creative and personal act. I have a tremendous amount of empathy for the younger generations because we talk about brand, we talk about story and storytelling and story building. I think all of us, whether we realize it or not, whether we want to or not, if we have any kind of digital presence, we're always telling stories and presenting ourselves to the world, and we want to control that narrative and put it in the best light. What I'm curious about, and I think since we have an expert here, I'd love to hear some questions about, when I talk to younger generations, what I hear a lot about is this desire for connection and authenticity, as opposed to like a barrage of media, a barrage of info, a barrage of stuff, but maybe there's less of this type of meaningful interaction and communication. Am I totally off base, or is that resonating with everyone, or anyone, I should say, the desire for more authenticity? Because I think that leads to creativity and discovery. You have a thought?
Yeah, I think it kind of like, sorry, I just talk louder now. But I feel like social media created like this kind of like facade where like everything's kind of like two-faced in a way, where like people put themselves out there to look like one thing, but seemingly like they're going through their own thing that they like post on social media to make it look like they're like the happiest person ever, they live like the best life, but seemingly like they're going through like deeper things and like they have trauma that they don't really want to talk about. But I also feel like I do crave that authenticity because I talk to my parents all the time, and like my dad was in the military, so it was a lot of like letter writing, and that was very much like heartfelt and very sweet to them, and like we lack that now. And I feel like there's not really a lot of that because a lot of like DMs and like on Snapchat you send videos, you text messages and stuff, and like when you're in a relationship with social media, that kind of like you're like craving that like, oh, I need them to text me back, and I feel like that wasn't a problem like 20 years ago, and I feel like that's been something that like came up with this generation where like it's all through our phones, all through our like computers and stuff. And I feel like we need more face-to-face conversation. That's where you really get the real, and that's where you really see their presence and how they're interpreting what you say.
Mm-hmm. You are correct. That is true. Oh, yeah.
Following up on what she said, I think that when I analyze like for something that I am struggling with, or like if I do look it up, like sometimes I like see different perspectives on social media and think, oh yeah, like that's 100% right. But then on the other side, the reality of it, and I'm also thinking that's 100% right, but at the same time, none of it's helping me. And like the constant question of like what's real and what is fake is like so relevant like to anything that like I am seeing outside, and it is hard to like find answers regardless of anything. And back then, like you just had to find it yourself. But now since we have the tools for it, you still don't know.
Yeah. That sounds very disorienting.
I think that's really exploratory, and I think that's it's got its pros and cons, I think, because you're getting different perspectives, which is awesome. No matter how confusing they are and how many questions they may create instead of answer, it does help you find your own answer to a lot of questions, which I think is interesting. And my next question was going to be using social media as a way to, I'm wondering to what extent social media is used as a vessel for storytelling. Because at its core, I think that's kind of what it is. If everybody's pretending or they're controlling that narrative, like you said, it's everybody telling the story they want people to know. And do you think that's healthy or effective?
What do you think?
Not sure. I think it can be. I think it can also be really detrimental because what tends to happen, I think, with social media that doesn't 100% or at least not as strongly happen in person is the comparative aspect of measuring how you're doing or how you respond. Because without the person in front of you, the response time is a lot slower. So you have a lot of time to think about this other person's story. Versus in person, if you're listening actively, there's not a ton of time to insert yourself. And now I'm just thinking out loud, pretty much.
I think, as people, we're meant to have attachments. We're meant to be in proximity. We're embodied. We have nervous systems. We need each other for regulation and co-regulation. We need each other to feel energy. We need each other for relationship. We need each other for love, for warmth. All of these things are very human. And so when you put yourself in a digital space, you're losing the body of the person. You're losing access to their face. And also, as we know, with the devices, the way that they're set up, it's set up to trigger a sort of chemical response in your mind that you end up having sort of a withdrawal experience. So in that way, you're messing with your internal physiology, which can disrupt all of your other relational capacity. But what I wanted to say is, I think there's also this sense of being really disempowered that comes from social media. And I just think that there's a truer story there, which is that you guys are all here right now, present. I'm sitting here with your bodies. It's the most amazing thing. And that's why I was like, come closer. Can we get with each other? We're so close, And if you're willing to be, clunky and cringy, that's the right word? Yeah, I have a 14-year-old. He won't let me use any of the words. No words. There's a list and they're all struck through. Right, but if you're willing to be awkward and uncomfortable and you can find a coalition of awkward people who awkwardly get together, you can build that. You actually have the power to build presence with one another. And it's one of the most important things you can do. It's probably the most rebellious act that you could facilitate for yourself is to play Dungeons and Dragons with your friends and have real life conversation with them. It's so bold. And it's one of, at least for me as a mother, it's the most important thing I do for my kids is put them in my house on beds talking to each other face to face. Because I want them to remember that the world is alive, that we are alive, yeah.
Also just kind of another thought going along with what he said. I feel like with social media, we have the time and we're so quick to either judge someone, and I feel like on Instagram you can go back to a picture or back to a profile and you have time to assess it and continue to make your own narrative on this person when you don't really know them. And you can look at a picture and just judge them so quickly, or not, you don't even know their story, and I feel like you just create this kind of whole picture of who they are, but you don't really know who they are. But in person, if I'm having a conversation with you, my body, if you tell me a story about something very traumatic that happened, you'll either see my body or my face light up, and that's when you really see the real, and I feel like that's when you get the POV and the in moment kind of response. And I feel like
that's why we need more in-person conversation and more hangouts with people to really, you feel who the people are and the vibe, and like you just feel like that's how you find your people. And I feel like that's how you find your support system, whether it's family, friends, or your team or anything. I feel like when you talk to them in person, you really can genuinely see what kind of person they are, and that's how you assess who you want around in your life.
Good. So you know what word, we've danced around it, but hasn't come up? And I'm curious.
Oh no, what word?
Vulnerability.
I was like, skibbity. No, that's not it.
Like, isn't,
Did I say it? Yeah, okay, got
oh,
it.
did you say it?
No, that's just one of the words I'm
Okay.
not supposed to use.
Oh. Well, so my question is, I think what we're talking about in a very positive way is this notion of positive vulnerability. Like, I think the authenticity and the connection by being able to be vulnerable, it's an honesty. It's a lowering of the guard. It's getting away from the online presence where we're putting our best picture and our best story and sharing only the good things. Understandably, maybe we don't want to share the bad things on social media, but by being in these conversations, we're able to open ourselves up to vulnerability, and then you can both support your friends and feel supported. But are there some tools that we can talk about, or to facilitate vulnerability, or make it less daunting, to allow people to understand? Like, I love the way you describe, like, that's a rebellious act, like doing authentic things. I love that, because that,
I want to come. That sounds so
right? But that's like an antidote to what I hear about as an old guy. Like, everyone's online and we don't connect. It's like, it's a rebellious act to want to interact. Talk about that a little more.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is that trauma is a wound. I mean, that's what we said. And when you talk about estrangement, right, we're talking about attachment wounds. We're talking about core relationships that ought to be secure, that have been ruptured. And so you have a wound there. In order to get access to heal that wound, you actually have to make that wound available to be seen. You have to make that wound available to someone to have access to it. And you have to be aware of what it is for yourself, to be able to name it and narrate it accurately, right? And that requires you to be vulnerable with yourself. It requires you to tell yourself the truth about what's happened and about what you need and what you want, and to become a safe person for you, to be the safest person that you know for yourself, right? Does it feel safe to ping pong back and forth between different kinds of inputs? Or does that create a lot of confusion for you? What do you notice in your body when you're doing that? Is that a practice you want to continue, or is that something you'd like to pause? I have to ask myself these questions. It's not like I'm not over here like, yeah, I'm crushing it. Slay, that's another one I'm not allowed to use. Right? It's being willing to notice, is this supporting me? Does this feel safe for me? Is this good for my body? Is this leading me to nourishment, to well-being? Or is this creating anxiety? Is this creating depression? Is this creating all kinds of maladaptive ways of relating to myself? And can I be the person to lead myself out of here? Am I willing to step into my own power to begin to lead myself into a place where I can be well with myself and enjoy people that I'm with? And you do have that power. It tells you that you don't, but it's just zeros and ones. I mean, it's really not real in that way. So that's what I would say. Get to know your own wounds, become safe for you. Do your work. It's important. It really matters. Yeah.
So again, playing the old guy card, when I was younger, we had diaries, we had journals. I'm just curious, and if you don't feel like answering, that's fine, but show of hands, are diaries still a thing? Does anyone here keep a journal?
Love a diary.
That makes me so happy to see that. Would everyone that does that agree that there doesn't necessarily need to be, unlike, say, classes and grades and competition, like the act of bearing witness to your own journey can be so informative and healing. And even if you never revisit the stuff, having been someone that kept journals, like it's a great gift you can give yourself. to be able to look back on that months or years later and see that growth and see the things that you wrote and say, either in a good way, like, hey, I was smarter than I thought I was, or look how much I've grown, like how dumb I was or how little I had learned. But these are such gifts we can give ourselves. I don't know if there's a question there so much. I'm so encouraged that there are people that do that. Are there other ways besides an old school journal or diary that, some tools for this personal creativity that people that maybe feel overwhelmed and aren't ready to share, but can chart some of this growth on their own?
I would create a story catalog. At this age, your brains hold a lot of memory. They will forget. They will. I hate to tell you. It just goes. Yes?
I have an idea.
Yeah, tell me. Oh, I love
Yeah.
your idea.
It's something an old teammate used to do.
Ah.
And it has to do with social media. But she had an Instagram account where she didn't follow anyone and nobody followed her. And she kept it private. So she would just post all of her things from her day. And the captions were just like all of her feelings from the day and everything that she did that day. So it was like not, because I keep a journal, I write it every night, but it's not so much the physically writing it, but it's keeping like a log. How she can always look back on, like she can just scroll and scroll and scroll. And she can always look back how she was feeling that day and like what these things made her feel and like recognize patterns that way.
I love that. That's beautiful.
Does anybody else have a strategy they would share or something? Because I that's so, like, in my day, that literally wasn't possible. Like, we took photos and had them developed. So what a cool tool that you don't even have to write. It can all just be visual. Like, there's all these different creative ways to track and tell your own stories. Yes.
Also going along with the digital thing, I feel like a lot of people will disagree. Like on Snapchat, like my best friends, I send them like 10-minute videos of me just talking. And I feel like those videos, like you can like save them and just send them. I don't save them, I just send them. But like just getting everything out and just knowing that like they're going to watch it and respond. And then I'm going to get like how their day is going and stuff. I just feel like that's a good like digital way of just getting it all out there. It's just sent. It's nowhere saved or anything. And it's just your feelings kind of come out. I do that to pretty much all my best friends.
Yeah, you got one right behind you. Thank you
that.
for that. That's awesome.
Me and my friends have Wacky Wednesday. So every
Love that.
Wednesday we get on a group FaceTime call and say how our week went or especially how our weekends go. And that's just one thing that like my friend group does, especially because unfortunately we're all across the country, so a lot of us won't come home for break to all see each other. So that's one thing that we do to keep in touch and stay in touch.
I love that. So great.
Thank you.
Just a plug for handwriting, though. Just a plug for handwriting, okay? Just a plug for it. Bilateral. Did you want to say something?
It was just going back to
Yeah.
the topic of journaling.
Oh, yeah.
There's all the digital media stuff, which is so cool. But I have a journal that I write in, but it can also be really daunting. So I have very small journals that I call my commonplace journals. Yeah, and so it's just like thoughts throughout the day, doodles, like anything from like grocery lists to something that I hear that sounds cool, or like an idea that I have for creativity, something to help me with my project. And like, if you just look through it, it's just like thoughts. And it's not linear, it's not a narrative story, but it tells a story of my everyday. And it's a lot less daunting than sitting down and just writing for so long.
I love that. What I'm hearing you say is that you're attuned to what works for you.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important to be able to notice. This is a practice that serves my heart. This is a practice that serves my body. And you get to pick what works for you in a way that nourishes you. And I think that's really important. Handwriting is very good for you, just so we're clear. You go from the left to the right. That's bilateral stimulation, and it actually helps your brain process to do that. So, processing painful experiences by writing them out is actually an amazing practice just to help the distress of your nervous system come down. So, you could try that sometime.
Here. I want to say one thing, and then yes, hold that thought. So thank you for that. And I would just say, as a writer myself, I always have to, even after decades of doing this, I remember, and Laura and I can bond over what we used to call free writing, or we still call free writing. Like in creative writing, the first draft is almost always bad. It's almost always messy. And what I'm getting, and what I found really refreshing about your example, and I would encourage everyone to just think about, is you can and should be messy, especially when it's for your own, consumption. Our lives, our stories are works in progress. So we're revising our own abilities, we're revising our own story, but getting it down and letting it be messy, that's a way we can be authentic and honest with ourselves. So that's good for us, and then that can help us be, better for other people.
It's really random. I kind of built up.
Random's good.
Oh, if you flip through my journal that I keep, it's like, when you're writing like on paper and your hand gets to the end of the page and it's like falling off the page and it's kind of uncomfortable. I like flip my journal upside down and like all of my stuff is written sideways, upside down, like you can't read it at all. Like she's seen it. It's really bad. But it's like kind of freeing in a way because like when you're writing a paper for like school or whatever, it has to like stay in the margins and like be in space. But when you're writing for yourself, it's just whatever you want.
But can I ask you?
Yes.
When you're doing that, what does that feel like in your body?
It's really more just getting everything out. So it's like unloading in a way. It's like taking the weight of the day off.
Yeah.
So, and I like just sitting, like my brain is a lot faster than my hand can write. So it kind of slows my thoughts down and like lets me actually like feel them and process them. And that's why I like handwriting it rather than typing it out. But I know that works for some people, so.
I love that. I think you find the thing that works for you. I have 3 kids, so songwriting is not something I can sit down and take time to do. I write all of my music in the shower, on a voice memo, or when I'm driving in the car. Not that I'm not texting it while I'm doing it, but I just voice memo it on there, just so we're clear. And then bring it all together when it's time. I don't write with an instrument, I write with my voice because I really don't have time to sit down and do that until it's all done. So you get to play, you get to find the thing, that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Try a lot of different things. You need contrast to know what's gonna serve you, what's gonna support you. So, yeah.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah.
So with all seriousness and respect for the amazing lessons we're learning, I think it's important to remember the fun. Like
So fun.
dealing with trauma, right, is serious. It's serious work. It should be encouraged. We need, find support wherever you can. But your stories are messy and have fun with it. I think that's a real kind of revelation for me to be reminded. Like all the work we're doing, it can and should be fun. And that leads to developing expertise at it.
Oh, healing is very fun. Healing is amazing. Like to move from something that's painful to something that feels settled, to be able to do something you couldn't do because you took the time to move through it. It's exceptional. It's like the most fun thing ever. And anytime I sit with someone, especially after they say, I've never told this story to someone else and their entire nervous system settles, that is the most fun thing, right?
Yeah.
Because they're alive. They're more alive than they were just moments before. So I think like aliveness is what I look for in people. It's like, how do we become more alive? How do we lean more into play? How do we find more love, more nourishment, more enjoyment? And not to be so cliche, but to follow your bliss in that way. So.
Heck yeah, follow your bliss.
Yeah.
What are we all here for if not to do that?
That's right.
So who feels, show of hands, that after this excellent conversation, they have a better sense of what story is and what story means in their own lives?
Oh, you guys, I did a good job. Thank you.
She did a great job. Wow. Big round of applause. Thanks again, Laura, for being here.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thanks for having me. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Totally appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you get your Beyond the Classroom credits on the way out. And I'm at sean.murphy@su.edu. So if you've got thoughts about the speaker series or feedback, let me know. Look forward to hearing from you. Everyone be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Rushed in.